Hey everybody, this is Joyce. Welcome to Medusa Was Framed. Thank you for choosing to spend time with me today. This video today is not about one place. It's a culmination of connections and relationships that are the result of the inspiration after listening to a firefighter who was working the Great Smoky Mountain fire that destroyed Gatlinburg in 2016. You probably remember that. There are at least 14 listed as having lost their lives, 3,700 acres burned, over 100 structures destroyed. This firefighter attested a great many more than 14 people passed. Those lives might have been firefighters or homeowners and such, but the numbers of people who were the homeless people who, or shall we say wild people as they were referred to in that area that were living in the Smoky Mountains, the numbers of those losses unrecordable. And this firefighter was one of the people who had to move those bodies down off the hill and dump them in mass graves. That's one issue, but that is not what this video is about. That story in itself is something that has been touched upon by many people, and there are plenty of videos about that. But what I wanted to look into was the relationship with one particular building in the entire city of Gatlinburg that this group of firefighters was sent to protect. This firefighter, their brigade, and another brigade were assigned to protect a building called the Mysterious Mansion, which is an old home, an absolute Tartarian Moorish home that has been turned into a famous haunted mansion that's open year round, not just for Halloween, where there are actors and whatnot. Gatlinburg has been, I suppose still is, a very touristy place, right next to Dollywood, which I am led to believe did not completely survive the fire. Why were two brigades of firefighters sent to protect a haunted mansion while acres of homes were allowed to burn? Why was it so important to save this mansion that when the fires, due to the geography of the area, the mountain ranges and tree breaks and such, and they became absolutely, completely surrounded by fire, were they then told that all communication was going to be cut off and they just needed to do whatever they could do to survive, where they had only the water in their trucks and no more? This sacrifice. Why was this mansion so important? A haunted house. It's a hard question to answer. I'm not sure that I found the answer, but I found a lot of interesting connections, and that's where I'm going to take you today. So buckle up, here we go. Before I get started, I need to point out to you that what I found was a grid. This mysterious mansion is in Gatlinburg, Tennessee, and I was just curious as to its alignment with other things, other poignant, significant, biomagnetically, bioelectrically charged places around it. First thing I thought was the Georgia Guidestones. I scouted out the Georgia Guidestones on the map. I scouted out the mysterious mansion on the map. And I started looking at that line. And then I put a pencil up to it on my computer screen and saw where that line went. And that line took me from Jekyll Island, Georgia, through the Georgia Guidestone, through the mysterious mansion, all the way up to Lake Michigan. Interesting. Through some big cities and some small cities. Looking at that on Google Earth, I then saw a shape tape form, and that was to Bermuda and up to DC. Now, I'll tell you When I was originally working on this, I found an absolute compass spiral of lines moving through this place, the mysterious mansion, and its connections along other grid lines all over the country. And of course, if you take the lines that you create in one region, for instance, the Michael and Mary lines that connect all of the stone circles in the British Isles, and you move them around the globe, you find fascinating correlations to other significant sites. So let's go to Jekyll Island. I recently completed a video about Jekyll Island. There is so much about that place that is available: books, extensive videos, many angles. The purpose of my video, as many of mine are about the reset architecture angle and the history they were hiding. We know it's the home of the Federal Reserve, that having occurred in 1913, and that relationship with the Titanic. I'm not going to go into a lot about that now. I encourage you to watch my video or read The Creature from Jekyll Island if you'd like to know more. Quickly, let's just say Jekyll Island became a place for the elite industrialist millionaires of that time, of the late 18 and early 1900s, to have a private playground. The Carnegies, the Rockefellers, the Vanderbilts, the Pulitzers, J.P. Morgan, and senators and congressmen. A playground that was built for them. A hunting island that was populated by the animals they wanted to hunt. And interestingly enough, the finds of a sacrificial altar dating back over 4,000 years under what is now the historical part of town, under the old post office, where skeletal remains evidence that human sacrifice was practiced there, where the raised shell and earthen constructions of the indigenous there, the Timucua and the Gula, were turned into golf courses and homes built upon them. In fact, John D. Rockefeller's home, built on an Indian mound, is referred to as Indian Mound. And the largest golf course on the island doesn't even hide the fact that all the hills and challenges on it are covered Indian Mound. But because the whole park is a state park, what we are allowed to know about archaeologically is completely dependent on the state of Georgia and what they're willing to share. But let's just say this. This is where we know that significant, powerful individuals at the time unequivocally related to the Titanic disaster and the people who died on the Titanic disaster and their holdings of wealth met in secret, in stealth, on Jekyll Island to form what became the Federal Reserve Bank. We know that the millionaires who built their cottages, as they were called there, vied for the mounds, the places that were already poignant and powerful and honored as such by the indigenous there, who they'd made sure were gone. The building with the room in which this transaction occurred is also built upon a mound near the altar, where there is evidence of human sacrifice dating back 4,000 years or more. And giants. There were giants there. Their bones have been found. You have to dig a little bit, but it's out there. And if you watch my video, I go into a great bit more detail about that. Giants and altars and the Federal Reserve, and how many state and national parklands are made so, not only to preserve them for your use, but to completely limit and restrict your research into the history that's there. So that's the beginning of that line. Let's move up now to the Georgia Guidestones. What are referred to as the Georgia Guidestones sit on State Road 77, 90 miles northeast of Atlanta, located in Elbertson, Elbert County, Georgia. In 1979, a man using the name Robert C. Christian, or R.C. Christian, commissioned Elbertson Granite Finishing Company to construct what he referred to as a compass, calendar, and clock for a small group of loyal Americans who had been planning this construction for over 20 years. In 1980, a small portion of Farmer Wayne Mullenow's land was leased by Christian to erect these stones. 10 stones carved with 8 languages, including 4 ancient scripts. The stones are 16 feet tall, and the capstone weighs 2,500 pounds. Elbertson is the granite capital with a granite quarry deposit of 35 feet long, 6 feet wide, and 2 to 3 feet deep. We are told that this place was chosen in part because the finest granite on U.S. soil is in this granite deposit. Part of the lease allowed for Farmer Mullenow to maintain grazing rights around the stones. And shortly after this project was completed, the property was transferred to Elbert County, who protect it now and protect its narrative too. On March 22nd, 1980, the stones were unveiled, and you see a photo from that literal unveiling. The stones provide advice for recovery after the apocalypse, carrying messages in English, Spanish, Swahili, Hindi, Hebrew, Arabic, Chinese, and Russians. Let these be guidestones to the age of reason. People have come from all over America, India, and even China to view these stones. This is a very eerie place. I live in northeast Florida. I have been to the Guidestones. It was very difficult for me to stay very long. They are very resonant. I have also been to Longborough and stone sites in Great Britain. The stones raised in places where the magnetic frequencies crossing underneath them is particularly powerful, and the quartz and the stones become antennas, as it were, become Wardenclyffe towers, moving the ether and the plasma from the air down through the stones, down through the quartz and the stones, to the water below, which is then transferred in the water and brought back up. And it is in that bringing back up that the, quote, free energy can be released. But if you alter that step between the water and the re-release of the energy back into the ether, into the higher ether, you can affect a great deal of the transmission. Just consider that. Georgia Guidestones lay on the 188 ley line, which is referred to as the line of death, an alignment of major catastrophes on the eastern seaboard. Also connecting Stonehenge, the period of the sun in Teotihuacan, the top 10 global earthquakes of all time, including Sumatra and Fukushima. They're part of the Great Circle ley line, 322 degrees on the compass, connecting Teotihuacan, Sandy Hook, D.C., the World Trade Center, Baltimore Ravens Stadium, Falcon Dome in Atlanta, Buckingham Palace, Stonehenge, CERN, Diana's crash site in France, Temple Mount, Dome of the Rock, Fukushima, and Sumatra, to name a few. In the town of Elbertson are an interesting arrangement of Tartarian Moorish homes and more than one obelisk, numerous granite monuments, and a farming community long known for its precious granite. Notice the Welcome to Elbertson march. Notice its Masonic feel. Not to be surprised, during the heyday of granite business, several railway lines passed through here in the 1800s, moving granite and other products, as well as Pullman cars and their tunnels beneath tunnels and underground bodies of water, because there's granite nearby. Massive deposits of granite. So of course there's water caverns nearby. Let's now move to the place where this video essentially began, the mysterious mansion. In Gatlinburg, a house long prior opened as an attraction in 1980. This is what 2 brigades of firemen were ordered to protect at all odds, letting anything else burn. In fact, the buildings on either side of it had burned. Charles Moore is listed as the principal of the company that owns an incredibly common name, one hard to research because of its commonality. But let's just say that along with he as principal, Mary Lou Jones, Lee Edward Copland, and Carol Copland are listed as the governing board, the ownership board of this property and the corporation. And we are to believe that Charles Moore is a descendant of the original owners, a haunted Victorian home you guide yourself through on your own. Each room is an escape room. You have to find your way out. The original family died in the house in 1903. I was not able to find any more history on who supposedly built the home or actually even when it was built, just that the family died in 1903. The family had gone insane, rumored as progressively paranoid in the community, and ultimately turned on one another, slowly killing one another. There was a 7-year-old girl who fell from a balcony next door. That house is now gone. She is rumored to be seen on her death anniversary. Apparently, she fell into the river and drowned. And those who see her experience her crying and pointing to the area in the river that she fell into. Since that house is no longer there, the story is her spirit gathers around the mansion. Besides the obvious geological dynamic here, the earthen actions that created the Great Smoky Mountains, this is also moonshine land, and there are miles of moonshine networks or passageways attributed to the moonshiners. Stories of using the tunnels by the moonshiners, but did the moonshiners build them or were they there? The oldest cabin in the Great Smoky Mountains was built in 1802, we are told, by a gentleman by the name of William Ogle. In 2017, National Park workmen were doing preservation on the cabin, and one of them fell through a place in the floorboards. He fell into a series of cabins and chambers dated to over 350 years ago. These have become attributed to the Cherokee on the land indigenously. Passageways, domiciles, an entire city, an altar, a palace, an open area like a Times Square. History raises the question of how William Ogle could have survived his first winter there in 1802 without crops, no storage. Did he hide underground? Did he build his cabin there because he knew of this access and he spent that first winter underground? Were there others there? Were there stores of food there? Gatlinburg is the primary resort city of Sevier County. The Gatlinburg mountain people, the wild people, many of which were the people who live with zero carbon footprint in the mountains today, who were allowed to die with no assistance during the fire. And we only know about that because people like the interviewee from this YouTube show I listened to had to carry their bodies and their children's bodies down. The mountain people in Gatlinburg were pro-Union in the Civil War and really tried to stay neutral. That made a lot of people unhappy. Gatlinburg is a home of moonshine and bluegrass. The area was originally known as White Oak Flats and became Gatlinburg after shopkeeper Robert Gatlin. He was in a feud between the family of founders, Ogle, which we spoke of, Ogle's cabin, Union versus Confederacy. Tourism began in 1900s when Andrew Jackson Huff opened a sawmill. Locals began catering their businesses to loggers and the logging company executives. The wild people we speak of were the main draw at the time, I suppose. One could make a comparison to people visiting parts of Pennsylvania for the Pennsylvania Dutch and Amish and Mennonite. The park's first hotel was built in 1916. the Mountain View Hotel by the same man who built the sawmill, Andrew Jackson Huff. Really? Hikers and vacationers have been vanishing in the Great Smoky Mountains since tourism began. Story goes that it's the feral people that are doing it, the mountain people. But how extensive are all these caves, these moonshine caverns? And yes, rail tunnels. Who built these caves? Who built those rail tunnels? Since it's a national park, we can only know what they tell us. But there's something about that mansion in Gatlinburg, or perhaps more importantly, under that mansion, that led fire executives to potentially send 2 entire brigades to their death. They didn't die, but they were willing to sacrifice them to protect this mansion. Or maybe to keep the mansion standing so no one discovered what was under the foundation. Next up the line, we find ourselves in Lexington, Kentucky, the Derby place, the second largest city in Kentucky. The county seat of Fayette County, noted as the heart of bluegrass. Lexington was founded in 1775 and named after the fort standing there, Fort Lexington. Kentucky was part of Virginia at this time. The city was devastated by cholera in 1833. 500 of the population of 7,000 died. Most notable, perhaps, are the 2 racetracks and horse racing industry there, Neyland and the Red Mile. Loosh. Loosh. 4 rail lines crossed through Lexington. The underground tunnel system in Lexington was discovered in 1776 with chambers 18 feet tall and one room in particular 300 feet long. In this chamber was an altar, idols, and 2,000 human mummies. Some were giants, over 8 feet tall. Moonshine tunnels. Huh? Lots of Moorish beauty in Lexington. Loosh. Loosh. Moving on up, we find ourselves in Muncie, Indiana, the home of Ball State. Named for the philanthropic family that is attributed with building it, the Ball family, as in ball jars. A proud family of 5 Masonic brothers. Muncie's popularity grew during the Indiana natural gas boom of the 1880s, bringing people in and expanding the railroad lines. The original home of Frank Clayton Bell, who served as the president for the Ball Corporation for most of his life, was built on 40 acres, and this estate was named Minnetrista. On this land were several homes, built to be a gathering place along the river for millionaires and industrialists who were visiting the country. The main homes were attributed to Lewis Henry Gibson, a student of none other than Henry Hobson Richardson. Minnetrista burned in 1967. In 1978, the properties on Minnetrista were reworked into a museum, public grounds, themed gardens, and the White River Greenway. Most stunning on the property, perhaps, are the colonnades. Moors, Tartaria, free energy. All that is to have left standing from the fire, perhaps earlier fire. The modern Minnetrista Cultural Center, which still stands today, opened in December of 1987. The Bob Ross painting series was filmed here in part of the art rooms of Minnetrista. There are tunnels under Muncie and under Minnetrista, along with mines. Many of them are haunted. A beautiful Moorish city. And what is surprising to be, I think personally, the most interesting location of all of these, and maybe that's because I knew absolutely nothing about this place before I started this journey, is Benton Harbor, Michigan, which is a sister city to St. Joseph's, Michigan, which is also referred to as St. Joe. And I just want to say what's interesting about that. I am a big fan of the songstresses of the 50s and the 60s, Keely Smith, Rosemary Clooney, that whole genre. I don't remember the Rosemary Clooney song. If I sat for a minute, I could sing it, but I don't remember the title. But she speaks of old Saint Joe. And I never knew what she was talking about when she said that. Now I know. She's referring to St. Joseph's, Michigan. Benton Harbor and St. Joe sit on the north and south side of the mouth of the St. Joseph's River and its connection with Lake Michigan. The entire area was originally St. Joseph's, and the Benton Harbor portion became named after Missouri Senator Thomas Hart Benton, one of those manifest destiny type fellows. What is left of this city indicates quite a beautiful place, a grandeur from time gone by. St. Joseph's is a fairly wealthy, well-established, white, touristy beachfront town. Benton Harbor is poor and black. In fact, they are attributed with having more toxic water than Flint, Michigan. Has long been a beachy destination, both sides. And as you can see, a major waterway, which I'm sorry, that was not built in the 1800s. Riverfront Park on the St. Joseph side is still a destination for folks in Michigan, Indiana, and across the lake in Wisconsin. The Vincent Hotel became a notorious gangster hangout in the 20s and 30s. Al Capone held court here. He kept his boat on the St. Joe River nearby. The sheriff at the time turned a blind eye against the gangland accumulation that happened there. It is rumored that the famous Valentine's Day massacre was laid out and scripted in the Vincent Hotel. And of course, you know, if the gangsters and Al Capone were there, you know that there are tunnels. Of course, they're attributed to bootleggers. But who built them? Al Capone didn't cross the street. He moved underground. Benton Harbor is most famous, though, for a commune, a Christian cult founded in 1903, known as the Israelite House of David. The founders, Benjamin and Mary Purnell, created both a self-sufficient commune and attraction and amusement park that flourished into the early 1900s, but then split into factions after this cult leader, King Ben, as he was referred to, was accused by several young women of sexual impropriety. 14 young women came forward in what became a national story. In the end, 300 total women came forward. 15,000 pages of documentation involved in the case. Benjamin was convicted of fraud, not a sexual charge. He was sick with tuberculosis at the time and died in 1927. During its heyday, what became known as the House of David included an amusement park that had a midget auto speedway, a tailor shop, an extensive botanical garden with a shop that sold seeds and plants from the botanical garden, a hotel with a vegetarian restaurant, a full baseball diamond with seating, and a considerable notable team that started to play competitively, as a matter of fact, in 1913. Music being taught as part of an access of God's light. Their band became known not only there as a draw for visitors to the amusement park, but eventually started touring. Vaudeville, the Orpheum, the Pantages, quite extensive. The amusement park itself was originally called the Springs of Eden Park, and it was opened from 1908 until 1973 in one form or another. Benjamin and Mary Purnell had visited St. Louis World's Fair in 1904, we are told, and wanted to create their own version of this, we are told. They had a coal-powered miniature railroad, which was the largest in the world at the time. 11 engines, over a mile of track, 40-foot train trestles over hills and bodies of water, camp and RV grounds, a roller coaster, roving peacocks, and an aviary, a zoo that included different animals based on season and what people requested, a completely self-sufficient biodynamic farm and botanical school, an ice cream production factory and restaurant, a vegetarian restaurant, they're vegetarian, a printing press, electrical trolleys, buses that they called horseless carriages, cruise ships up and down the St. Joe River and out into the lake, a jam and jelly factory, their own train depot with different grades of track to accommodate not only their miniature train, but large trains bringing people in. An interesting fountain. Is this a fountain or a plasma device? And the Silver Beach Carousel, to name a few. In 1895, Benjamin Purnell had visions of the seventh angel of Revelation, from Revelation 10:7. Gather together the tribes of Israel prior to the second coming. The Israelite House of David was founded in 1902. Benjamin previously was a traveling charismatic preacher. He had originally formed a community in Faustonia, Ohio, then moved to Benton Harbor, we are told, to attract more tribes with access from water and rail. Most members were from Ohio and Indiana, but some actually came from Australia. The men were not allowed to cut their hair or shave their faces. The women were also not allowed to cut their hair. In the 1930s, it reached its peak of 1,000 members. But they were interactive. They knew they had to survive. So they created commercial opportunities for tourism to bring in the money they needed. They even printed their own postcards to attract people from far and wide. Purnell died in 1927, buried in the mausoleum on the grounds. The commune divided after his death into two factions. One kept the name, the other just went with House of David. Benjamin's widow, Mary, built up the House of David to include a thriving Jewish resort, which contributed greatly to the livelihood of Benton Harbor and St. Joseph's, St. Joe. Mary passed in 1953 at the age of 91. By 1966, the group was less than 100, rebounded into a closed community, and remains to this day one of the oldest American practicing Christian communities. Across the river, St. Joseph, the original Benton Harbor, being St. Joseph, has the most amazing lighthouse configuration, as well as a shipping channel that is comparable to many the world over, not built in the 1800s. The South Pier Inlet. St. Joseph City was named after the old French fort, St. Joseph, originally established by the French explorers in the region, those in the fur trade. What remains of House of David includes the Silver Beach Amusement Park, built in 1891. The St. Joseph River connects south central Michigan to Lake Michigan. Port St. Joseph and Benton Harbor were communities of timber and produce. 1675 is the first record of white folk in the area, the French, originally part of St. Joseph, the entire area. As I mentioned before, currently the water situation in Benton Harbor is worse than Flint, almost impossible for the poor communities living there. And the division of black and white is not new. There are not commented on, but considerable, if you read about them, dock riots in Benton Harbor in 1966. Benton Harbor is mostly black, St. Joseph's mostly white. During the Civil Rights Movement, this division made it worse, as it did in many places. There was black and white fighting in public places as black youth tried to reclaim their rights to areas, as happened here in St. Augustine. These fights became more and more frequent, and one evening came to a bloody head outside of a roller skating rink that ended in one dead and 300 black youth fighting with white police, and then they headed to the mayor's house. In the 1930s, the Benton Harbor Fruit Market was the largest cash-to-grower non-citrus market in the world. Fort Joseph. We are led to believe that Fort St. Joseph was built in 1691 when Louis XIV granted land on this new claim of theirs to, guess, to who? To the Jesuits. This was the land of the Ottawa and Ojibwe. The St. Joseph Light. Believe, if you wish, that the station complex was built in 1832. Believe, if you wish, with upgrades added in 1906 and 1907. Believe, if you wish. Decommissioned in 2005. Believe, if you wish, that the harbor piers began in 1836. Believe, if you wish. Remarkable engineering. House of David had a streetcar. A streetcar, an electric streetcar. Not bad for a wandering, charismatic creature. And, wait, what? A moving stairway. Those things you hop on in the airport to move you along? Yeah, they had one of those there too. Now, though this isn't attributed to House of David, just look at this construction. Water Street Bridge, we are told, was built in 1885, 320 feet long, 20 feet wide. Believe, if you wish. And Splash Park. There's a splash park. This is a big one. What are they really? You may have seen some of the other videos from Michelle Gibson, to name a friend, about how many of these trolley parks, and apparently this was a trolley park because there is a trolley that would take you from downtown to the park, may actually have been industrial centers, tech centers of some sort, and that many of the so-called rides were actually quite mysteriously similar to contemporary equipment used at water treatment plants. Makes you wonder about those splash parks. And what's up with the carousel? Those big antenna tower swing rides. What's that about? That's a ride? Or is it Antiquitech? And the trains. That train with all those cars. So this commune owner had the resources, the technology, and the funds to hire the people that had the skills to build these trains. 40-foot trellises? St. Joseph and Benton Harbor had key side-wheel steamers in the Great Fruit Belt, that being the line between Chicago and Michigan. They were built in St. Joseph. Who built them? Whose technology was that? And if we need any more proof of this being Moorish, Tartarian, whatever you want to call it, here we have the Salzman Premier Bathworks, which during a time was a major draw for tourists in the region. Underground water, mineral water, what does that speak of in terms of limestone development underground? Benjamin King Van Purnell died at the age of 66 from tuberculosis. He was born in Kentucky. His House of David was fostered on a communal lifestyle, demanding that the converts refrain from sex, haircuts, shaving, and eating meat. His first construction, in his realization that they needed to be open to the public to bring in needed income for survival, was to build a concert amphitheater and ice cream factory. You think he built that? Ice cream factory? I wonder if he found that. Apparently, the addition of the miniature train was next to ferry visitors along the extensive course, which includes what remains on the beachfront amusement. He's supposed to have built the miniature ships that moved up and down the St. Joseph River, along with smaller boats. The miniature ships were used for fake battleship fights in the park pond. They had a large auditorium that included the showing of silent films. Several bowling alleys, not a small contribution, an arcade room, a pool hall. In the 1930s, House of David was hosting 200,000 tourists yearly. They were entirely self-sufficient. They even had their own car dealership. Gas stations. That requires a great deal of underground earth movement. And though they didn't drink, they had a nightclub and a beer garden. The band, their baseball team, considered interesting because of the long hair and beards, was successful from the 20s and into the 50s. There were men and women players. And an interesting note is the black players at the time, who were, of course, facing different kinds of discrimination across the country, often played with this baseball team because they could be disguised under a fake beard and wig. People wouldn't notice their skin color. Satchel Paige is one of those people. While the members of House of David were toiling on the land, living in commune poverty, Benjamin and Mary amassed 10 million. Benjamin, being a preacher, performed weddings, but also what he called blood cleansings, which is essentially the act of the first night, where he purified the new bride by having sex with her first. This became spoken of in the area and rose concern, and local law enforcement at the time began investigating, but somehow word always got to Benjamin and he was able to escape. The Detroit Free Press wrote an expose pressing the state's attorney to act on this. In 1926, his former mistress, Bessie Daniels, revealed he was living in underground chambers that led to other parts of his property and all the way to the water. They raided this location and found him in bed with members of his harem who lived full-time underground. As mentioned before, the colony split in two. Mary, his wife, took half and moved across the street. Mary died in 1953. The park began to decline and closed in the 70s during its heyday. An interesting place, falling to ruin. Look at a Google Earth view. So those are the lines, the connection of considerable note that were all a great surprise to me. And I will let you decide what you think of all these cities on the grid that all have underground tunnels were considerable train connections. But we're going to wrap this up by talking about what I saw after the fact when my eyes just started playing geometric games. And that was the triangle that is formed above the Bermuda Triangle, linking Jekyll Island, DC, and Bermuda. So what I have for you here are some screenshots of some things that I saw within that triangle. Noting, of course, that Google Earth is known for over pixelating and cutting and pasting images that you see, especially in areas where people are talking too much on social media or raising too many conspiracy theories. When you're in Google Earth, you can choose 2 or 3D. When you choose 2D, you can see elevation. It's not just lines, glitches in the satellite imagery, but actual elevation inconsistencies and changes, and draw your own conclusions. Interesting angles that I don't think could be caused in nature. What do you think you see here? This is all within that triangle. And speaking of star forts, there are a great many star forts on the eastern seaboard. How many star forts exist within this triangle alone, coastal Georgia? How many military bases? Some of which are star forts, some are not. What's beneath military bases? We'll never know. Now, wait a minute. Wait a minute. We've been talking about all these underground caves and tunnel systems, but we're in Bermuda now, an island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. And you mean to tell me that there are underground caves and caverns on an island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean? Yes, Crystal Caverns, and a 12-acre park called Blue Hole Park, full of a network of tunnels, caverns, and underwater pools that run most of the island. A lot to think about. And I'm not interested in drawing conclusions that I'm trying to shove down anybody's throat, but simply in sharing the interesting correlations that I find. So I thank you for joining me today in my exploration that started with wondering why 2 brigades of fire professionals would be potentially offered as sacrifice to what seems to have been organized destruction in the Smoky Mountain fire, placed in harm's way in a dangerous place geologically to protect. It's not just a house. We know that what lies beneath this house is something the value of which we are not supposed to know. But what we do know is that there are tunnels in all of these places, from Jekyll Island all the way up to Benton Harbor. So I will let you decide what all of this means. Thank you. This is Joyce at Medusa Was Framed, raising my cup of coffee to you in gratitude. See you next time.